Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Chris Boomsma, Chief Executive Officer here at the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, or CAST, and it's my privilege to kick off today's event and soon hand it off to our experts that are with us today. I'm glad you've joined us. Today, we're talking about the potential for U.S. agriculture to be greenhouse gas negative, and it is a real privilege for CAST to partner with U.S. farmers and ranchers in action and the experts that they've assembled to bring this report together. We're very happy that you've joined us today for this event. So a little bit about CAST now before I hand it off. First of all, we are a 501c3 membership-supported nonprofit organization. Lots of organizational members, lots of individual members, formed over 50 years ago. Proudly nonpartisan, apolitical, and we are also very science-based and unbiased. So happy to chat with anybody at any point more about CAST, but that is the basics of CAST as an organization. Now, a little bit about our mission. First of all, we convene and coordinate networks of experts to assemble, interpret, and communicate credible, unbiased, science-based information. You can see some of the audiences we have here: policymakers, the media, the private sector, and the public. We're very happy today to be with a great network of experts on this report, joining with USFRA to hopefully reach the audience we so intend to reach. Our vision is a world where decision-making related to agriculture, food, and natural resources is based on credible information developed through reason, science, and consensus building. That is the core of who CAST is. How do we accomplish our mission? Truly, it's through the help of many, many volunteer contributors. You'll meet some of our volunteers today. We have a number of board members across 3 different boards, many active task force members working on reports at any given time, and a lot of volunteer scientific experts that serve as authors and reviewers. Many of these individuals come from academia, you'll see that today, but some come from government, the private sector, and other nonprofits. So with that, I am going to hand it over to my friend and my collaborator here, Kevin, CEO of USFRA. Kevin, welcome to the webinar and take it away, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. And on behalf of U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action and our board of directors, I'd like to thank Chris and Carlos and the terrific team at CAST in helping us bring this very important research forward, which speaks to U.S. agriculture's enormous potential. USFRA, just a little background, is a farmer-led organization that works to champion U.S. agriculture and also lift the voice of farmers and ranchers on issues like conservation. Together, our membership represents approximately 700,000 U.S. farmers. You know, as we talk about this report, I think it's important to recognize the fact that the hero of U.S. agriculture's conservation story is the farmer. The average farmer, and this is a global number actually, the average farmer uses at least one regenerative ag practice, and the average farmer actually uses 7 regenerative agriculture practices, and that's according to some new research by USFRA board member Baer. And you know what's really exciting is that potential is enormous to do even more in the future. And that's one of the reasons why we at USFRA established an independent group of 26 leading scientists and researchers, really a who's who that work in this space. They felt so strongly about this project and about this research that they volunteered their time and expertise to the project. Together, they were able to identify current practices as well as emerging technologies that have the most potential to reduce emissions and increase sequestration. The findings were peer-reviewed, which you'll learn more about today, with support from FAR, the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. The National Academy of Sciences appointed a 6-person committee to conduct that review. The report, Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative, provides further evidence of what's possible for U.S. agriculture. We can reduce GHGs. We can improve soil health while also increasing farmer profitability. As we meet today, it's interesting that the 2024 UN climate change is underway, COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. It's there that USFRA is going to be partnering with 4 other leading ag organizations on a side event to talk about this report. Dr. Chuck Rice from Kansas State University, who you're going to meet in a second, he will be there along with our immediate past chair, Marilyn Hershey, a dairy farmer from Pennsylvania. She's also the current chair of Dairy Management Incorporated. They'll be speaking to the key findings from the report, as well as talking about how agriculture is helping to solve some of the world's greatest challenges. Okay, well, let's get going to the meat of our webinar today. I mentioned Dr. Chuck Rice. He, along with Dr. Marty Matlock and Dr. Jerry Hatfield, are the 3 lead researchers on this project, and they contributed literally countless hours on this project. It doesn't happen without their leadership and guidance, and we can't thank them enough. You'll hear from all 3 of them today, but I think Marty is going to start us off. Marty, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Kevin and Chris. It's an honor to be here. We started this work from a conversation we had at USFRA's Honor the Harvest, first Honor the Harvest Symposium in 2019 in Delaware, in a hot barn on a farm. We happened to have in that hot barn with a whole bunch of participants, 3 former USDA secretaries of ag, as well as the current Secretary of Ag at the time, Sonny Perdue. And so we were challenged as groups to envision agriculture in 20, 30, and 50 years, and what stories we could tell of success, and then to identify where the barriers were to achieving those successes. Our group with Secretary Vilsack in conversation said, we think agriculture will be a part of the solution to our current greenhouse gas emissions challenge and the current carbon budget challenge that the world faces. We think that greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in the United States could be net negative. So we asked ourselves the question, what do we have to do to actually demonstrate that? How can we show that, in fact, we have the potential to be greenhouse gas negative in the ag sector in the United States? So if you go to the slides, we'll share our journey for getting there. Again, you can see we pulled together a group of 26 experts from around the nation. And so Chuck was with me at the time, Chuck Rice. And so we said, let's just go find out who's willing to spend the shadows of the day answering this question, because this is an effort of the willing of academics, members of USDA ARS, as well as from NGOs to address particular sectors. So we started out with defining the need for achieving greenhouse gas negative ag. Chuck and I wrote that chapter. Then Ellie Ellis, Amy Swan, Keith Postian addressed the challenges and opportunities for soil carbon sequestration. Philip Robertson and Bruno Field, who you'll meet in a minute, Elizabeth Ainsworth, Deanna Osmond, and Renulo Lolato. Sorry, it's very small text on the fonts on the slides. You'll get the report. You can see all these names. Wrote the closing the row crop yield gap chapter. Ermias Karabab, Kim Stackhouse, Logan Thompson, Jasmine Dillon, and John Sheehan wrote the animal protein production challenges and opportunity chapter. I worked with Tom Richards at Penn State and Greg Toma and Rob Annex from Colorado State and Wisconsin, respectively, on the energy and energy use efficiency chapters. By the way, all the affiliations are indicated in the front material for each chapter. Alex Nicholson, Venera, Julius Berlon, Leigh Prescott, and Pete Pearson wrote, mostly from World Wildlife Fund, wrote the food loss and waste chapter, which is a bit of an outlier because it's not production process based. But we felt like we needed to address food loss and waste as we talked about all of our opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to give it context that it's not just farm gate level activities. John Andelin, Susan Capalbo wrote the economics and policy research section. And finally, bringing it on home, I worked with Greg Toma, Chuck, and Jerry to write the final results, analyzing the so what of it all and asking the question, what are the probabilities we can actually achieve these goals. Again, this process was peer reviewed. Chuck led the initial phase of the peer review process. He was the chair of the Board of Ag and Natural Resource at the time with the National Academy of Sciences. Chuck, you want to explain the trials and tribulations of peer review?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marty. Yeah, so I'm Chuck Rice. I'm at Kansas State University, a University Distinguished Professor. And as Marty said, I was board chair of the Board on Ag and Natural Resources for the National Academy of Sciences at the time that we were developing this report. So what the National Academy was asked to do was set up a committee, an independent committee, after these chapters were written, as Marty described. And so there was a 6-member committee that spent a fair amount of time, several months, going through the report. The peer review process, they had experts that reviewed the individual chapters, and that ended up to be a 30-page critique of our report, and that's publicly available at the National Academy website. And then after we received that critique, then our authors had an opportunity to respond to those comments, both at a global level, and there was actually line by line comments made on the individual chapters. And so then Dr. Jerry Hatfield will lead the discussion on how we responded to those comments. Jerry?
Chuck and Marty, I mean, as both of them have mentioned, this report has been thoroughly reviewed, and we can't express our appreciation enough, first to the authors for preparing this report, and then to the reviewers that made it even better. I think that is always the goal of the whole review process, is to take a product and improve its quality. And, you know, you think about all of this, there's over 700 comments that were line by line in this document, so that had to be responded to, and we took them seriously. We went through each one of them. We actually not only made the change within the original report itself, but we also documented in response to each of those comments. So when you look at the whole peer review process, it's a original comment, response to that comment, and how it impacted the report and all of this. So it really does show the rigor that we went through, and it really provides confidence to the reader that this is the best information available to help producers, help academics, help agencies understand the role of agriculture in a greenhouse gas negative world and everything. So it's a pleasure to be part of this. Marty, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, just to remind you of the timeline. So 2019, we decided, let's take a look. Chuck and I reached out to Jerry, and we started accumulating a community of the willing, of scholars and authors who were willing to write. We had our first draft ready by about 2021, and then COVID hit just as we were going to review. And so that delayed our review process significantly, because we all remember well, maybe we don't anymore, the disruption that was that pandemic. And so finally, as the shadows of the pandemic receded, we were able to start, but we finally just last spring, received the review comments in early spring. And Jerry, Chuck, and I did the first draft of revisions and sent them back out to all the authors to get their comments back. So again, the amount of effort, the amount of time, 26 people intensively working over this period of time, it's a monumental task of volunteer effort from willing people with optimistic views of agriculture. So I think we go back to Kevin now. Is that right?
I believe.
Yeah, so this is my
Yeah, Chuck, I think you're up next. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just give an overview of the key findings of the report. The opportunity areas, you saw some of the chapter listings, but there was 5 opportunity areas that we summarized, and one is soil carbon management, and I'll give some examples here in a minute. That represents about 40% of the opportunity for U.S. agriculture to be greenhouse gas negative. Nitrogen is a critical nutrient for growing crops and in both crop and animal agriculture. And so, but it represents 85% of the nitrous oxide emissions come from management in agriculture systems. So we had to look at nitrous oxide, and there are several identified areas that we can reduce nitrogen, but at the same time, that means increased profitability, because nitrogen is not only a high quantity input cost, but or high inputs, but is a high cost factor in production agriculture. The third area was animal production and management, both in methane, primarily in agriculture, primarily comes from the production of ruminant animals, cattle and dairy, and then how we handle manure and manage that is another key component, and that's in particularly swine and dairy systems. The fourth area is increasing, intensifying, and diversifying our crop production. Jerry Hatfield led that as one of the lead authors. And if we're going to reduce land, make more efficient use of the land area for production, we need to look at closing the yield gap in management practices that can improve yields and do more on less land, essentially. And then the final area is agriculture is energy intensive, and therefore, how can we be more efficient with energy use on the farm, and even looking at on-farm production of energy. And I'll go through some of that. Yeah. So these are some of the key areas. And so in soil carbon or carbon management, as I mentioned, carbon sequestration in soils is a key element strategy. And so we're looking at some of the current practices that's ongoing, but then switching from corn ethanol to herbaceous biomass crops has a role in developing or enhancing carbon sequestration in soils. A second area practice is taking marginal lands that are less productive, and some would argue that the return on investment is very low or negative, and switching that to perennial cropping systems. Those perennial cropping systems could be used for biofuel production, for pollinator habitats, or even forage production for animal agriculture. And having those deep roots placed in the soil will sequester carbon deeper in the soil and at a greater rates. And the third area, which is pretty common practice or useful practice, but definitely needs to be expanded, is conservation tillage, no-till being the prime example. We're less than, well, it depends on the area in the United States, but maybe 20 to 30% that's continuous no-till. In Kansas, we're actually closer to 40 to 45%. So there's a huge opportunity to expand conservation tillage, particularly no-till. Just put that in context. South America, Brazil, and Argentina are over 90% continuous no-till. So there's an opportunity for U.S. agriculture to reach levels of that around other parts of the world. Nitrogen, as I said, is really important. Looking at precision conservation, again, what Phil Robertson and Bruno Basso illustrated in their chapter is that we need to do, again, looking at that farmscape, as I like to call it, is where do we put our inputs to get the best return on investment? And so looking at those fields or parts of the field even that should be used for additional nitrogen or nutrients, seed placement or high seeding rates, and then smartly apply other uses of those fields for reduction in nitrogen, but then can still produce products from that farm. The other nitrogen practice is spatially variable nitrogen application. That's technologies that's actually available now. We just need to ramp up the implementation, but it requires data management, technical assistance, and decision support tools for managing that nitrogen in a variable way across that landscape. Energy, as I also mentioned, looking at direct energy use, the switch from grass crops or forage crops to provide cellulosic biofuel production. And again, that's part of this precision conservation is, can we identify areas of the field, grow perennials, and then make better use of our inputs? And there's a huge opportunity, a large opportunity there for cellulose biofuel production. And again, this whole report is about systems, so there's synergy. We can create cellulosic biofuel production, but then also sequester carbon in the soil at the same time. Another area is on-farm solar and wind. I think this is a huge opportunity to make an impact. Essentially, farms can be not only self-sufficient, can be an exporter. And in Kansas, a large part of our landscape is used for wind turbines, and we're farming underneath those. So we can directly develop energy, renewable energies, and solar energy as well. There's a lot of roof material, roofing that we could put solar panels on, a lot of our farm structures, as well as even some solar farms that we could farm underneath those that could help drive the electrical equipment needed on the farm. And then the last area is animal agriculture. This is probably a little bit more difficult, but I think in our report we identified areas that are doable in the next 5 or 10 years. And this is increasing our efficiency of our feed. When we're more efficient, then there's less methane produced by the animal, and also actually turns out to be more productive. So it's a win-win situation. In those grazing systems, improved grazing management, whether it's planted grasses or our native rangeland across the western half of the United States. Again, using proper management, whether in native systems, fire and grazing systems, or in planted grasses, again, developing nutrient efficient grass systems for our livestock. And then, of course, then the end product manure management, again, a source of nitrous oxide and primarily methane. There's tools there to reduce those emissions, and you can actually even capture some of that methane for energy conversion. So I think there's plenty of opportunities here. And again, the message for this report is not just one size fits all, and there's several multiple strategies, but we need to look at that farm as a systems, and there's multiple avenues and some synergies between these practices. So in the end, the next slide, yeah. So this shows then the quantity that potential, and you can see they're listed in ranked order. Blue is the medium adoption rate, which is about 50% adoption, and the aggressive high adoption rate is 75%. So not 100%. And so with the current available practices that's already available, some research is needed to help get over some technical hurdles, but a lot of research is needed for demonstration and technical assistance. So again, nitrogen fertilizer management, those two areas I mentioned, carbon sequestration, enhance that with less tillage, with perennials in the rotation, and then on-farm energy use. Animal feed management would be the top three. So feed efficiency is really critical, and a lot of our livestock producers are achieving some of those goals already. And then on-farm energy use, grazing management, manure management. So a total reduction of the current available practices with medium and then aggressive adoption, that we think that U.S. agriculture can be not only neutral, but 4% greenhouse gas negative. So we can help draw down greenhouse gases or emit less greenhouse gases than some of the other sectors. And then the other category there is emerging practices with a little bit more research, but then increased adoption are shown there. I won't list them all, but you can see those. Again, perennials, land use change, increasing on low productivity land. The total reduction, about 100 million metric tons. So if you add those two, the current available practices and some emerging practices, then we think that U.S. agriculture, within a short period of time, 5-10 years, can be negative 6% greenhouse gas emissions. So next slide. Yeah, so again, right now, U.S. agriculture represents 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. We think with medium adoption, we can get almost to zero, 1 or 2%. And then again, high adoption, and we're not talking 100%, we're talking 75% adoption, then we can draw down and actually be 4 or 6% greenhouse gas negative. So I think this is a huge opportunity for U.S. agriculture. And it's not just reducing greenhouse gases, but again, many of these practices help decrease input costs and increase profitability of our farm operations in the United States. So I think it goes to Jerry.
Yeah, it's you're probably asking the question about, so what? We have this really big report that lays out all sorts of information and everything. What remains to be done? How relevant is this report to the average producer out there? And you really have to look at this and saying, here's a number of different techniques that we've identified that have the potential not only to improve productivity, but also improve production efficiency, improve profitability. And so the relevance of this report is really just beginning. And if you look at this almost 100-page final report, there's an interpretive summary that goes with that kind of boils it down to information that can be readily used. But the whole goal, and I'll reinforce a point that Chuck made, is that we're looking at this as a system, not saying that we're just looking at the corn part of a corn-soybean rotation, but what is that whole system look like? How's it draped across the landscape that might have influences in terms of water quality and all the other pieces that go with that? And so there remains much to be done, and I'll just point out a couple different things. And when we talk about soil carbon sequestration, we're talking about the application of what's now coined regenerative ag practices, reducing tillage intensity, increasing biodiversity, keeping that ground covered, using cover crops, integrating livestock. Well, the real question is, how do you do all that? And so we need much more on-farm research in terms of how do we begin to bring these practices together? How do we put them into a decision context that can help a producer look at these and say, yes, I can begin to do these things, and here's the impact of those on these fields. They may be a different impact as we move different soils within that field. And it's not going to be a system that you could be transferable across everybody, because if we move from east to west and we go across that precipitation gradient from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, there's going to be different responses in all of this. So we need to be understanding that here's the dynamics that go with that. The same thing in terms of animal feed efficiency, and how is that coupled with manure quality that comes out, and how do we manage that manure to put it back into that system. All of those things are critical. And if you look at it from that, is that there's much to be done yet, but it's not an unsurmountable problem. It's a matter of taking a lot of these practices, putting them into play for a producer and saying, what does this mean for you in terms of stabilizing your production, increasing your production efficiency, increasing your profitability along with that. So I think that as we look at this report and having two particular endpoints, one is to a challenge to the research community and saying, here's things that need to be done yet. And another is an opportunity to the producer to look at this and saying, here's some things that I can now begin to consider. And I can think about these and begin to put them into my system and look at it and say, yeah, this can work. And I'll just play off of that one aspect of nitrogen management, is looking at spatially variable nitrogen application within a field, saying if I've got parts of that field that aren't responding to nitrogen, I'd be well off in terms of how do we begin to reduce that nitrogen application, develop the techniques to do that, look at that response and all of this, a number of different ways, and how does that play over time. And so everything that's there has the capability of being transferable to a producer. And I believe that when we think about all of this, it's really about integrating the producer and the researcher and the extension or the educator all together as a package to say, we can make this work, and these are end goals of what we want out of this. So these are the things that I think become fascinating about this report, but also give us a challenge to say, here's what we know today, and how can we begin to implement this so that by 2030, 2050, agriculture is really achieving the goals that we talked about in here. So Kevin, I'll turn it back over to you, because I know we want to have a discussion about all these different pieces and what goes on.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Dr. Hatfield, Dr. Matlock, and Dr. Rice. I think you can tell how excited they are about this report finally getting to the finish line and being published, and all the hard work that they've put into this. Carlos, do you mind if can you come on the screen? We're getting a lot of questions in the comments about logistics in terms of the full report, the interpretive summary, and making everything available. And I know you've been answering those in the comments section, but do you mind just coming on screen and walking everyone through the kind of where the report is and how they access it, and the recording, et cetera? Do you mind handling that before we get into some of the questions and answers?
Sure. So the full report and the summary are available on CAST's website. So cast-science.org/publication. That's where you can go to find all our publications, and especially this report. So we'll have, if you go there, you'll find two files: the interpretive summary file and the full report file. And then after the webinar, we're going to upload this video to USFRA's YouTube channel. So, and if you have registered for this webinar, you're going to get an email with more information about the recording and how to share and other details. So stay tuned.
Terrific. Thank you for that. And we can bring our speakers back on the screen if you don't mind. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm hoping you can help us. We've got one here from Toby. about not seeing any mention of enhanced weathering for CER, pH management, reduction of fertilizer. Would be great to hear the speakers talk about their view of this practices. Which one of you all would love to tackle this one?
Well,
Chuck?
yeah, well, I just had a conversation. Both Jerry and I are at the Agronomy, Crop, and Soil Science Society of America meetings. And just a couple of hours ago, I was talking to somebody about rock weathering and enhanced weathering for carbon reductions. And that was not discussed in the report because it's still a lot of research that's needed. And we were looking at solutions that were either, were ready or near ready for implementation. So there's still a lot of science that probably needs to go in order to identify the enhanced weathering process. pH management, of course, that's probably a common agronomic practice. And so, depending on what crops you're growing, maintaining a good pH for active microbial activity. And of course, I'm a microbiologist by training, but the microbes are the key driver for converting or plant material into sequestered carbon. So pH is essential in that mix. And I don't remember what the other question was, but
reduce fertilizers, and we did talk about that. Jerry talked about that, especially conservation implementation of nitrogen fertilizers and phosphorus and potassium, but nitrogen's the big one for greenhouse gases. Reduces costs to the producer, reduces environmental impacts both to water, soil, and the atmosphere for greenhouse gases. So nitrogen conservation is the big lever to pull. Farmers want it. Everybody wants it. We have some available technology. This is an area where advanced technology in the coming years, not decades, will transform farmer choices. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, and I'd just like to bring a little bit on that, on the reduction of fertilizer use. And if you look at that, closing the yield gap, we did pay a lot of attention to how do we look at nutrient management. What's the role of improved genetics, that biodiversity is part of this? How do we improve the efficiency of that plant when we start looking at nutrient management? All those pieces are together, and it's not a single factor that we're looking at. We're really looking at this as a total system to say, looking at water management, you look at the nutrient management, you're looking at genetic selection, you're looking at even the crop selection as part of this. All of those things play together in contributing to this. And so I urge everybody to read this report from the standpoint of saying, here's the opportunities for agriculture, and here's things that we need to be talking about and doing right now, because they would pay advantages for us.
Thank you, Jerry. Got a question from Garth there on the screen. Surprised to see medium adoption of manure management have such a small impact. Any of you like to speak to this?
Well, yeah, that chapter was written by, of course, Ramias at UC Davis and Kim Stackhouse Lawson, who runs AgNext at Colorado State, and several other folks. Jasmine's at Colorado State as well, and others. So it's not that there's not a positive impact from wet manure management, and especially capture of biogas. The challenge is that much of the impact comes from nitrous oxide emissions and methane, and those happen during the process of transport, capture and transport too. And so it's such a fast process of loss of those high impact molecules that makes it difficult. Jerry, you've really worked on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, you look at this, and Garth, it's good to see you online and everything, but part of this manure management it was a very quick process when we think about the dynamics of all of this in terms of the exchange of methane coming out of it. And so manure management was really about handling that manure and then the biogas comes off of it is a little different piece of that puzzle in terms of capture. And so it was really about taking existing systems, lagoon systems, more wet systems. How do we look at that? And I think that's what contributes to those numbers being as low as they are. But I do think that we have a great opportunity in manure management to do a couple different things. One is to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. The other is to improve that nutrient and carbon piece of that to put back on the soil as a positive soil amendment. And I think that when we think about regenerative ag, we always think about that animal piece of it. Everybody just envisions cows standing in the field. The animal piece, I think, is much more oriented to how do we effectively use manure as part of that cropping system in terms of that overall process, because we do see big advantages of that.
And if you look at Chapter 8 from Antle and Capalbo on barriers to implementation, cost, financing cost, major barriers, and those technologies that you're talking about, Garth, we all know oh so well are expensive capital costs and operational costs. So the farmer can't just bear those costs. There's no payback for the farmer that comes close to the cost of implementation. So there's another strategy so these are some of the big tangled knots we have to work on. How do we pay for these things?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. There was a question about methane inhibitors as well, and I believe it is addressed in the report, but would any of you like to address that?
Yeah, we didn't go into seaweed for cattle because it's an emerging science, but by golly, it works. I mean, if you feed these things non-lignified cellulose, they don't need to methanogenesis associated with breaking down lignified cellulose in their gut. And so it's a feed conversion advantage. Anything you can do to feed the animals things that they convert more efficiently equals money for the producer and less emissions to the atmosphere as methane. That's all good. But there are some other issues with rumen ecology that are just emerging in the sciences. These are not established practices yet. We had to draw a line somewhere at established practices where we had good data of implementation, because that table of all those little numbers that Chuck showed you were our probable reductions in percent from baseline of existing technologies. Many of these technologies, even this, we don't have adequate data to predict the benefits yet in broad implementation. We hope to get those data. I'm telling you, this Climate Smart Ag initiative is a data collection initiative that will give us, in 10 years, a whole lot more knowledge than we currently have about how these systems work.
Yeah.
And I believe that some of those inhibitors, like the seaweed and other things, were addressed in the chapter. It just, we're just listing the top 10, right? So, but there are mentioned in the chapter of things coming down the line, as Marty said.
Yep, absolutely. And Chuck, you've mentioned this a couple of times, but I think it's important to note again, when you speak about emerging technologies, you're not talking about 50 years from now. You're talking relatively near term. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we're and again, when, as Marty said at the beginning, the former secretaries of Ag, they were saying what was 30 or 50 years down the road, and we could have done that. But we wanted to look at what's near term, five, maybe 10 years at most, but 5 years. What are, maybe it's a little bit of further research, tweaking it, but a lot of part is, like Jerry said, on-farm research to get the numbers to convince producers to adopt some of these practices. So it's a little bit further fine-tuning that research, but then it's mostly showing that those numbers can be done on farm and getting adoption of those technologies. So that was kind of our boundaries.
That's super helpful. There's a couple questions in the comments also, and Marty, I think this is a topic that you're really great at addressing in terms of farmer adoption rates. How do we get farmers to accelerate adoption of certain practices? What do they need? What would be helpful to them? Can you speak a little bit more to that topic, please?
Certainly. We all understand that farmers are stewards of the land. We understand the land ethic that is the core of our farmer framing for how they produce. We also understand that farming is a business. It is a for-profit enterprise in order for those farmers to stay on the land and to keep farming crops instead of people, which is what housing developments do. And so trying to keep that land in agriculture, because it's privately held, means that we have to have an economic framework that makes these practices pay. They have to pay either in direct increased revenues or decreased costs, which both result in increased profits, or they can also pay in decreased risk. By using certain practices like conservation tillage, you can reduce water stress risk for extreme weather events, droughts, for example, or you can increase nutrient use efficiency, and therefore reduce nitrogen demand, which is a direct cost. So this is a systems within systems framing. Farmers are very good at this. They're intuitive systems managers, and they're explicit profit managers. So we have to talk in terms of profitability and risk management for the farmers. And that means we have to have incentive programs that reinforce those values for the farmers. And if we want to keep land in practice of agriculture, because the pressure for land transformation from agriculture to urbanization is persistent and it is high.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think, Jerry and I have, Jerry gave a talk yesterday about connecting with producers, but just an example, you have to demonstrate, transfer that knowledge from a academic university small plot setting to a real farm, right? And so just as an example, we have a on-farm research network for soil health. And so we're working directly with farmers, showing their current practice and then some improved practice that we negotiate for soil health, or it could be greenhouse gas negative, right? And so we, over 7 years now on some of these farms, we've had close to 800 people at field days to help transfer that knowledge. And that's part of the showing that it can be done in their soil, climate, region, and it's not something coming from another state or another part of the state, and that it can be done in their region, and that helps disseminate and increases the adoption rate. We need to have more of those networks.
Yeah, it's just to play off of Chuck's a little bit, that I'm a big believer that if we want to advance this, that communities of farmers that are trying these practices to share their results. As Chuck said, you get 800 people at a field day that all coming from a region around there. They can look at this and say, yeah, this would work on my farm because I identify with these soils and this cropping system and everything. So I think that we have a lot of work to do in terms of this, but it's a partnership set of work that goes on. And it's really getting the producers engaged to say, this would work, or this doesn't work.
Wow.
We're big boys. We can take negative results as well. And I think part of this is saying, we can try this, but now we need to understand why this isn't working, maybe in some places compared to others, and realize that not everything is perfect. And yet there's a lot of things we don't understand about these interplays that go on, particularly when we get into the systems level concept that we're talking about.
Terrific. There's a question from Emily Oldfield. She's asking about how were GHG impacts quantified and estimated for this report?
We use the IPCC global warming potential approach because that's really all we have for analyzing the various relative impacts. And we used IPCC Global Warming Potential 100 for these approaches. However, we recognize, and we say this in our conclusions, we recognize the difficulty with that is that this is biogenic carbon. This is not geologic carbon. So this is carbon that was at best in the atmosphere 2 years ago for some animal feeds, mostly in the atmosphere last year or this year, and released back to the atmosphere this year, either as CO2 or as methane. The nitrogen's different, but nitrogen fertilizer was in the atmosphere and then is converted and put back in the atmosphere through the Haber-Bosch method. But biogenic carbon in particular is challenging. That's one of the other innovations we need. We need a better way to assess the impacts of biogenic carbon. Chuck's been working on this fairly extensively as a soil microbiologist, but we did use the global warming potential from IPCC for assessment, just so that we have standardized numbers to talk about, and so that it can compare with the EPA report too. Sorry, Chuck.
No. I thought you were sorry. I didn't want to cut in, but the individual chapters, they did a literature review, like the carbon sequestration, carbon chapter. Those are from studies conducted across the United States where they quantified carbon accrual increase in different practices, rotations, no-till, and et cetera. Same thing with the nitrogen management chapter. Phil and Bruno, they looked through the literature and where they quantified the N2O emissions, both measured and then validated models, because N2O is hard to quantify on an individual field basis. But so there's rigor and quantification in those individual chapters as well. So then Marty said, we used IPC numbers in the global estimates, but there's a lot more detail in those individual chapters.
And I think that part of that, just to add a little color to that, Kevin, is saying that's why we really are much more restricted to say that practices are already in place, because we could have confidence around those numbers. Emerging practices, a little bit like that enhanced weathering, that's such an infant science right now and infant technology that we really have a hard time quantifying those numbers across enough range that we can give what I would consider a confident answer to this. Everything else, we're fairly confident about this because we've got the formulas, the guidelines, and the expected range of values that we see across the literature that cover a pretty wide range of exposures to different systems.
Yeah, there's continues to be questions and discussion about adoption. And what do you say? And really, every farm is unique, every field is unique. We're in different places in terms of their journey, in terms of conservation. But what do you say to the farmer and rancher who has implemented many of these practices already? And how do we continue to incentivize and encourage more? How do we keep them going? Is there anything in the report that might address that group?
Well, the early adopters are the heroes of the story because they're the ones that prove whether it works or not. And they're the true innovators. The whole point of this report is that our greatest inventors, innovators, and discoverers in this process are the farmers. We need to ensure that everything we do gives them further freedom and flexibility to continue to explore and innovate, and not try to prescribe a set of practices or procedures that have to be followed, because prescription of practices just restricts innovation. Outcomes are what matter. We've said this from the very beginning of our discussion of our sustainability journey in agriculture 20 years ago with Field to Market, the Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture. Outcomes matter. How you get to your outcomes equals innovation and invention and customization, site-specific, farm-specific, philosophy-specific innovations. Let the farmers farm.
And I'll add just quickly. Sorry, Kevin, but I've worked with several farmers and then our own research. But as we implement some of these practices like conservation tillage, no tillage, nitrogen management, rotations, we're seeing those soils evolve. Soil health is improving, and so now we've changed our carbon and nitrogen dynamics. I got a research plots. There are 34 years of continuous no-till and compost, and we're seeing some fantastic changes in that soil that alters, that carbon nitrogen cycling. So I don't, implementing one of these practices like conservation tillage. Well, then we can add cover crops, then we can add rotations, then we can add organic amendments. So there's a whole suite of things that are synergistic, and we're changing that soil, that cropping system environment. I remember talking to one farmer. He said every 5 years he's learning something new and having to adopt change something because the system is evolving. It's not static.
Yeah.
Just to add to a little bit of that, Kevin, and producers, I would urge producers to go back and look at their own data, look at their yield monitor data, because what we see is we improve that organic matter, we improve our capacity to store water and capture water, is that we see increased uniformity of fields in terms of looking at yield maps, all these different things. So I would urge them to start looking at multiple years of their progress and out there, and then they can say, then what else change do I need to make in this? And I think they'd find out just how successful they've been in this adoption practice. And then they, as Marty says, then they can innovate and say, oh, I'm going to add this tweak now to my system and all of this because I'm willing to try maybe something a little different because I've seen this response.
I think that is a terrific summary. I'm going to do one more question, and then we're going to bring it to a close. There's a question from Sarah, who's a farmer in Texas, and she really appreciates the discussion around farmer profitability and minimizing risk management. She asked a question about what the role of the consumer plays in all of this. Which one of you would like to address that?
I'll start. Since I've worked with Walmart for a number of years and other retailers in the supply chain on trying to understand consumer, and I've watched their analyses of consumer preferences across the retail establishment. There's a certain expectation amongst American consumers of a baseline competency and humanity of their food. But the general sense across market is by and large, consumers don't pay for sustainability. They expect it. They don't pay for it because they expect it. Anything less than that is substandard for the consumer. So that's a reputational risk for the supply chain. If the consumer has a sense that what they're buying isn't meeting their expectation, it's not that they'll go buy something else. They'll just stop buying that. And that's a problem. That's a problem for whole sectors. So the challenge here is to protect the reputation of the sectors. First and foremost, to make sure you're not doing bad things. And when we talk about bad things, think about the clothing sector and child labor or slave labor and what that has done in supply chain choices and decision making. So that's an example of reputational risk. Should the consumer go into a grocery store and have to choose product A because it sequesters more carbon in the soil than product B? Is that a choice that consumers should make? The general sense is no, the consumer is already hammered with so many environmental labels and other labels that becomes just numb. So the opportunity, though, is for the entire sector in a pre-competitive way to be able to make claims about what we are doing as a community of producers, processors, distributors for the consumer to reduce negative impacts and to enhance positive value. Those are the things that the consumers have to do. Chuck?
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking a couple examples. We just started a regenerative ag initiative at Kansas State University. And so we're working with some companies, supply chain, and King Arthur is an example, high-end flour, but they're looking at sourcing their flour from regenerative ag produced wheat. And so they have a customer base that's willing maybe to pay, or at least King Art's willing to pay a premium for that wheat. And then, so I think, there's going to be a whole suite of consumers out there, but I think there are some consumers that are willing to work with food companies to source some of their products from regenerative ag or sustainable ag practices.
Yep. Well, thank you. We are at time, gentlemen. Chuck, Marty, Jerry, thank you so much. Thank you to CAST. This is one of the most comprehensive meta-analysis of U.S. agriculture ever done. And we are really pleased to be involved in this. It is helping, it's another piece of evidence that shows that U.S. agriculture is indeed part of the solution. Thanks to everyone for your time today. Have a good rest of your afternoon.